Thanks for joining us today, everybody. You're here at the Standing in the Gap webinar, the intersection of tradition and innovation in family school partnership. Now, this is coming to you as a collaboration with the amazing folks over at SchoolSmart Kansas City. Want to give a special shout out to Awas Sufi, a special shout out to Juan Rangel. Chiefs actually won a game last week, Juan, so I know you're feeling really good. Shout out to everybody in Kansas City. Thank you all for being here. We invite all of you to join us and engage with us today, as you're already doing. Let us know where you're from in the chat. If you have any questions for me, for the panelists, use the Q&A feature. We just want to make this feel like we're in the corner of a loud coffee shop or in a living room. Like we know it's a webinar, but we really wanted to make you feel like, like we're all here together, right? We have an amazing panel here for you today. They're going to introduce themselves a little bit more formally later, but just letting you know, we have Dr. Cokethea Hill with us from Kansas City, Missouri. We have Dr. Sue Hong with us from Wellesley College in Massachusetts. We have Maddie Sims, who's in New York City, and we have Ann Williamson, who's in Washington, D.C. Folks from Coaction Collective are in the chat, fielding any questions if you have any of them for us. And I'm Mike Andrews. I'm one of the co-founding partners of Coaction Collective. Now, Coaction Collective, we're a pretty brand new organization of experienced and passionate educators centered on family and school partnership in schools and communities. Now, at Coaction Collective, we operate from this motto. Okay, we operate from the motto of our outlook is appreciative, our approach is collaborative, and our destination is liberation, right? Strong words, intentionally, right? That's the lens that we use and we encourage others that we partner with to use when inquiring into and impacting that family and school partnership. That's the lens that we use: appreciation, collaboration, and liberation. And now more than ever, I mean, any industry across all sectors of the United States, you could apply that tagline now more than ever, right? Because there's a lot going on right now. We're in the middle of multiple pandemics, right? We know that at this exact moment, literally, family engagement, right? The term, the philosophies of family engagement are being used by politicians, by the media, kind of to encourage what's happening on the school board and in the schoolhouse, what's being taught to our children. It's a lot, right? We also know that our teachers are struggling. It's been a hard 20 months. Families are at wit's end as I exhale, thinking about my kid who's walking my dog right there outside the window, right? We're operating at the cross sections of all of our identities as dads, as moms, as caregivers, as teachers sometimes, as gardeners, as directors, as CEOs, right? And then we have our students. And for a lot of different reasons, our students aren't really centered in this conversation. So that's really what we're doing here today, trying to just engage in a dialogue about what that partnership means. How do we utilize that partnership to protect our most unprotected populations, right? The communities that are most impacted by all of the systems. So that's what we mean when we say standing in the gap, right? The gap between what used to work and maybe what might not work right now, right? The tried and true practices, the gap between the tried and true practices and where we could innovate. Like, what can we dream of? How can we engage with communities with honesty, right? Centering like humanity, the human experience that we're all going through, so that we can fearlessly stand in that gap. So that we want to be very intentional about that title and what we're asking you all to do today. So Our amazing panel is here to have that conversation. I don't have the answers. Our panel is just going to engage us in the dialogue so that we could start to unearth and speaking from that perspective of standing in the gap. So our panel is going to help us think about where we are right now, our current reality, where we could go, right? Like the potential for innovation, and then what do we do next, right? So that's the framework here. All right, so we're going to jump into our awesome panel. We're going to start with Dr. Hong. And you know what, my screen, all the panelists walk onto the stage, please. If you're if you're here, we'd love to see all the panel. You know, this is the moment when you're in the audience and everybody starts clapping and screaming and you walk out. Thank you all so much for being here. Just so happy to have you all with us. If I can start the conversation with you, Dr. Hong, just how in this exact moment, thank you for that applause, I see you, Dana. How are you thinking about family and school partnership? Like what does that phrase mean to you?
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm really excited to just kind of be in dialogue with this great group of people and just have an audience full of people who care about our families and want to see us engage them in meaningful ways. And so my name's Sue, and I am an associate professor and chair of the education department at Wellesley College, which is a small liberal arts college in Wellesley, Massachusetts, just about like 9 miles outside of Boston. And we're a women's college. And so I teach in the education department. So I primarily work with undergraduate students who are interested in working in the education sector in some way. Sometimes as classroom teachers, sometimes as youth workers, interested in doing research and policy. But a lot of the work that I do with students here is really around kind of helping them understand what the field of education is. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is, especially through the courses that I teach, is that when we think about schools, we're often thinking about classroom learning, and we're thinking about relationships between teachers and students. And I try to encourage them to be a bit more expansive about that. And I think all of the people in this group are folks who believe that we should think a little bit more expansively about that. So thinking about the ways that family and community and society impact the way that we create educational spaces for young people. So I'm also a parent of 2 kids in the Boston Public Schools. I have a 7th grader and a junior in high school. And so a lot of what we talk about today, I think about through the lens of not just being a researcher and a teacher to undergraduates, but also as a parent of 2 kids who have had very different kinds of experiences throughout this past 18 months, like of pandemic learning. In Boston, you know, my kids were not really back in school until the end of April last year. And it was so late at that point that, you know, at least my teenager felt like, what's the point of going to school now? Like, I've been in this virtual space for so long, I don't really understand why I need to go into school. And primarily it was, you know, for her was to be able to connect with her teachers and just be able to meet them in person. So, you know, a lot of what I think about this is kind of through my perspective as a parent as well. But, you know, I think as a researcher, we think a lot about kind of building this relationship between schools and families. And I think a lot about sometimes like how the world of school and the world of families is disjointed or disconnected. You know, in particular, I'm working with pre-service teachers right now in my current research project, but I've done previous research looking at the role of community organizations, and then another book that I wrote that was like focused on the experiences of teachers. But I'm always kind of interested in this relationship between schools and families. And it's been interesting to kind of look back on the past year, because in some ways, like we've figured out how to build connections and close that physical gap that has plagued us when we're trying to like think about school family relationships. So, you know, for my pre-service teachers, as an example, they weren't able to step inside of the schools for a moment last year, but they were able to connect with families, you know, because the school and the classroom was the living room or the kitchen or the dining room or the bedroom. And because we were in a virtual space, they were also able to connect with families in ways that they didn't, you know, in previous cohorts, didn't really have that kind of access to. But so I think we also saw that it was easier for families to connect with teachers as well. So I had, you know, you hear about parents who are able to do parent teacher conferences while they're at work because they get like a 15-minute break that's okayed by their employer and they can kind of zoom in on their phone. So it's been interesting to see the different ways in which the use of our virtual tools has allowed us to interestingly, in some ways, close a gap that was kind of a physical gap that was present for us. But I also feel that, you know, in my experience as a, you know, middle school teacher and elementary school teacher before, it was so important for me to build relationships with my students' families. And it's not lost on me that this is difficult now, you know, because schools are kind of, parents are shut out of schools, often can't really be in the buildings yet. And I think this relational approach and the authentic relationships that we try to build between educators and families, I don't want to lose sight of that, because I think in some ways Zoom introduces a different kind of formality to those relationships. It makes us closer, or it kind of makes the interaction possible, but in some ways it also kind of introduces a distance and formality. And the last thing I would say is, I think as a parent, it's been hard for me because it's been difficult to get to know my kids' teachers. And, you know, virtual open houses are a thing now, but it's also very easy to kind of be in a situation where everyone's cameras are off. People are listening. You don't really know if they're really there or not. We can't really be in the school building. I don't really feel as if I have a sense of my kids' teachers. And so you know, obviously there are challenges that remain for us. So like one of the things that I kind of think about when we're kind of thinking about standing in the gap and looking at what's happened in the past year and a half is like, you know, how much can we take from what we've learned to kind of think about this as a creative moment, versus thinking about family engagement as an afterthought. Like I really get nervous sometimes that our reliance on virtual tools sometimes like encourage us to sort of check these boxes that we've done these things to make connections, so that it sort of encourages us to think about family engagement as an afterthought versus like trying to think about it as like a true innovation.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Hahn. That's an awesome opener. I feel like I learned so much about you just in that opening. I did not know you had an 11th grader. Why haven't we been talking about this whole time? You got some things you need to share with me about dealing with that guy out there. Anyway, thank you for letting us know who you are, and just letting us know like where you're coming from right now with family and community partnership. Maddie, same question to you. How are you thinking about the engagement space right now, and introduce yourself to the webinar?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike. And I just want to start by saying how appreciative I am of the opportunity to be here today alongside a group of folks who are really doing such important work to support really that equity-driven reimagining of how we're talking about school-family partnership going forward. And I referring both to my fellow panelists and all of those of you who have joined us for today's conversation, really just appreciate the chance to be in dialogue with you all. So as Mike mentioned, my name is Maddie Sims, and I'm a director at Columbia University's Center for Public Research and Leadership, or CPRL. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are an interdisciplinary center that works with a range of school systems, state departments of education, nonprofit organizations, and foundations across the country who are really working to advance educational equity through a variety of channels. And so we bring together both leaders and graduate students across the fields of policy, law, business, and education to work on solving some of our tough problems that really require diverse skill sets, experiences, and expertise. Personally, I'm a lawyer by training, and some of the project work that I'm involved in right now is focused on really pursuing state-level policy change that can really support that locally responsive innovation that truly builds upon families and communities' strengths and ideas. And so CPRL's work has always been grounded in a really strong commitment to co-creation with diverse stakeholders. And so school-family partnership has always been at the center of our work. During the pandemic, of course, with the shift across the country to remote learning and living rooms becoming classrooms, we embarked on a series of projects focused on listening and learning from families, from students, from community organizations across the country, with a particular focus on those groups that have been traditionally underserved by the education system. And so our research for this really focused on a couple key questions. First, what were the challenges that families were facing as they sought to support learning and growth during this incredibly trying time? But then equally as important, what were those bright spots, those innovations, small or large, that families were experiencing from their schools, from their children's educators, that were really making a difference and that they wanted to see carried forward? In other words, really trying to understand what can school systems, educators, policymakers learn from the past 18 months that can really inform our approach to school-family partnership going forward. And so just a couple quick themes that I'll note in this introduction that really stood out, and Mike, to your question, are really informing how I'm thinking about school-family partnership today. First, really the need to revisit how we're defining the word communication. Too often, we're hearing communication really referring to one-way information flowing from schools to families, rather than the type of two-way communication that really values and leverages all of the incredible insights and strengths that families can really bring to support children's learning and growth. And so during the pandemic, a lot of the families who we spoke to who actually said their students were getting the individualized or differentiated supports that they needed were those families who had that consistent two-way dialogue with educators in their children's buildings. And that was really a way for them to ensure, to Dr. Hung's point, really that relationship building between educators and families was taking place. In addition to speaking with families and students, we also met with educators and school system leaders with a particular focus on staff who are working in school-family partnership offices, such as family liaisons. And family liaisons are doing such incredible work every year. And several of them said in many instances, the pandemic was actually the first time that they felt others in their district or building were really recognizing the essential role that they were playing. But they also shared that too often, a lot of these family liaisons felt like they were sometimes on an island. Educators in the classroom somehow receiving the message that family partnership is something handled by the family partnership office and not something that needs to really be baked into the structures and processes throughout the school. And this is unfortunately even more true in schools that have large populations of families who speak languages other than English or communities that have been underserved in the past. And so many systems, one of the bright spots that we've seen is systems really starting to recognize that the need to ensure high quality professional learning that is really readying all educators to engage meaningfully with all families and not just those who might show up for an in-person event. And so I'll pause there, but just really appreciative of the opportunity to be in this dialogue and excited to hear about all the great work taking place among everyone's organizations.
Thanks so much, Maddie. I'm feeling something here that this intro is so rich. I feel like we could highlight each of you on your own webinar in the future. I'm just thinking to the future. So just, mark your calendars. Dr. Hill, thank you for being here. Same question to you. How are you thinking about family school partnership right now?
Yeah, well, hello to everyone, and thank you again. I want to echo the sincere gratitude and appreciation for those who have taken their time to join us today, and certainly to you all for putting together such an amazing panel. My name is Cokethea Hill. I am in Kansas City, and I see some Kansas City love in the chat box. I know I have some hometown folks that are joining us. I represent an organization. I'm the CEO and founder of BLAQUE. BLAQUE is an acronym. It stands for Black Leaders Advancing Quality Urban Education. We are a 501c4, and I always take the time to really talk about that designation because it allows us to engage directly in the political process very differently than a typical 501c3 nonprofit. But a lot of the work that we do really still falls in that umbrella. It is not, the electoral politics is not a significant portion of our work. But really our mission is to significantly improve the academic, economic, social, emotional, and life outcomes of African-American children in public schools. And certainly I know a lot of you all have an education background, so you understand the challenges that disproportionately affect kids of color, particularly Black children. And so we are unapologetically in that space, and that we are working to move the academic needle for those students. If you visit our website, you'll see core to, we call them values, but really these are like fundamental principles that we live by. We always center the needs of students, right? We believe that parent and family voice is essential. In fact, we don't believe that we can have a high-performing school system or a high-performing school district without having parent voice and presence and being an active and engaging piece of the teaching and learning experience. And then we really center on working with and not doing to communities. We are not here as the experts. We certainly have some resources, some tools. We believe we have a network of folks that can kind of highlight, but we believe that the community and parents are experts in this space, and we work to support and build capacity for our students and our families. When we think about family engagement, particularly at this point, but just thinking about launching BLAQUE, we are like bold and audacious leaders and thinkers. We believe not only can we reimagine the system of education, but we can work diligently to sometimes disrupt, dismantle, and rebuild it in a different way. And so what we were hearing and sensing from parents and community leaders is that historically, family engagement has been this kind of one-way process by which the school invites the parents in to these key times of the school year to solicit or elicit their feedback, right? So parent-teacher conferences, muffins with moms, donuts with dads, a play that is coming, or, should we change the colors in the hallway? And while that's great at building like this culture and this welcoming environment, it really wasn't the level of engagement that families really wanted to have in play in their in the lives of their children. And so we really thought about like, how can we shift this lens so that families have more authority? We amplify their voice, and they are key collaborators in policies, practices, protocols in teaching and learning that really not only just drive student achievement, but create these inclusive and welcoming environments. And so when parents really start unpacking that, they were like, hey, many of the times that we're engaged is after something has already happened. The playground has been built. Come celebrate with us. We've already created this calendar. Here are the days where you come. We come into parent-teacher conference, but the grades are already in. And so parents really wanted to come to the table, with equal power and equal voice, and to be co-collaborators in the process. And so we have been thinking about intentionally, what does that look like? So when we launched BLAQUE in October of 2020, we had an election. That was in April of 2021. And many parents were saying, hey, if that's the decision-making body, we want to have voice there. We want to be a part, and how do we run, and what is the school board's role, and all of those things. And so that started really our process of building capacity, but also creating intentional on-ramps for engagement, and not waiting for the school to invite us, but really saying like, hey, we want to be a key partner with you. And so so certainly I know a lot of us will dig into our work, but that's really the core of how we view families. We want them to be equal partners and participants and engage in not only just the fanfare that happens in school and not only just the teaching and learning around their particular child or children, but to be thought of as an advocate, a policy making group that wants to have some influence in those decisions that are being made about their children.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. We're going to hear more about the work you did with the school board after we hear from Ann, as you introduce yourself, and just how are you and UPD thinking about family school partnership right now?
Thank you, Mike. And of course, thank you for having this conversation and also inviting me to be a part of that conversation. I'm Ann. I am a director at UPD Consulting, which is based out of Baltimore, but we work nationally. And I direct the economic mobility portfolio at UPD. Prior to my time at UPD, I worked both for the District of Columbia's Office of the State Superintendent of Education. So I have some time on the ground in education departments, and then also in the mayor's office. And, I brought a lot of those skills and those ideas to UPD, where we work with clients across the country in the spaces of education and economic mobility, and then also just public sector equity in general. And so my work centers around the use of data and design to build or to transform public programs. And I've specifically been invited here today to share with all of you about a school-centered housing program that we're building right now with the city of Baltimore. But Mike, as my short answer to your question, I think when I think about that, I think a lot about the needs of these families beyond their school lives. So their housing stability, their food security, wealth building in these families. And then I think a lot about how we could provide much more intentional and robust supports to schools to help them leverage their partnerships with those families. So as folks on this webinar are likely well acquainted, schools have this unique and very intimate relationship with the families they serve. And they're asked to engage with these families on issues that really take quite a bit of additional expertise and resources that exist outside of that education system. And there's some blurred lines there, and there's some conflict in how schools are asked to engage in this work. So the question that I'm always pondering is, how do we continue to get government agencies generally to add in more concretely their pieces to the family supports puzzle, and then to do that through this prime relationship channel between the schools and the families, because that connection is already set up. And I believe that these agencies together can actually amplify their outcomes in ways that they wouldn't be able to see if they didn't share this programmatic governance over the work, which I know is kind of a wonky word, but this idea of just being able to share that programmatic challenge together, as opposed to trying to address it in different silos. And of course, there's already models out there trying to do this work. There could be more models out there trying to do this work, and more the merrier. But I think it's imperative that we move this work from these one-off good ideas, which I think maybe we all know one of or a couple of, and we can point to, and to start thinking about building those models into system-wide changes in the ways that governments collectively go about the work and the ways that they invest those resources in that collective work. So I want to recognize and say out loud that it's not easy work. Everyone here in this discussion is well aware of that. Later in the discussion, I'm going to share more about the work that we did in the city of Baltimore to connect the affordable housing work that sits within the purview of the Department of Housing and Community Development with the needs of Baltimore City schools to support their families experiencing housing instability. And it's everyone, whenever I explain this, people remark, oh, that's such a simple, elegant concept. And I think you're all going to recognize too that it isn't a simple concept, but it still presents challenges in execution and shared governance and funding and other operational issues. But what I'm hopeful about in all of this work and all of this thinking, and what I want to highlight here is that Baltimore leadership, and that's from the mayor to the agency executives to foundations to school leaders, see that they can't solve these issues in small and siloed investments. And this is a newish shift that is happening right now, and they are ready to make the big investments. In fact, one of our steering committee members was in a funder meeting, and they kind of put their foot down. They're like, there is no other choice. These types of investments are the only way forward in making the progress we want to see for these families. And I'm hopeful that that mindset shift towards major system change will bode very well in supporting schools and their partnerships with families, not only in Baltimore, but hopefully in other jurisdictions around the country.
No, you gave me the perfect baton, and you passed it to me. I'm going to pass it right back to you while you're talking about the work that UPD is doing in Baltimore. Can you just, like, as plainly as possible, talk about the program that you briefly started mentioning? You're right; it is a powerful partnership opportunity. Just give us some high level, some bullet points on that program. Love to hear more about it.
Sure. Maybe can I start with the origin of where
Sure,
this
please. Yes.
started?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because I like to give credit to this, and I think it's very powerful. It actually started as an idea by an elementary school principal in Baltimore, Joe Menko. He's now at Able Foundation. He would, of course, every day he'd put the children in his school who had been identified as housing unstable under McKinney-Vento. Those students, many of those students needed taxi cabs to get to whatever shelter or couch they were staying on. And so he would put the students in the taxi cabs in front of the schools. And as he's shutting the door, as he tells it, he'd look across the street and there were just vacant house upon vacant house across the street. And here we are sending kids all over, taking all of their time to transport them to, living conditions which are not ideal, right? That's not stable housing for them. And so he went to the Baltimore Commissioner of Housing with this idea, asking, what can we do about these vacant properties, of which Baltimore, by the way, has a lot of city-owned vacant properties. And what was compelling to DHCD, the housing department, and was very clear in the data, is that housing instability had significant negative impacts on children and their mental health and on their academic performance, and that those effects of toxic brain stress stuck with children long after they experienced that trauma. And then there was also compelling data around housing stability and how it creates school enrollment and stability, attendance stability. And then additionally, there's, of course, this large supply of vacant properties, which causes a lot of community disconnectedness. And that's kind of saying at its best, there's a lot of blight and there's a lot of issues with the number of vacant properties. And it just struck as an excellent idea. So we took Joe's idea, we went to Fannie Mae and got a challenge grant, and we leveraged that to build a model where we leverage the affordable housing work that the Baltimore Department of Housing and Community Development already does. They're already good at, and they are building affordable housing. They're doing it through a community development corporation. They don't actually do the building and maintaining themselves, but they run these contracts. But what's different and unique about this is then those housing units become, essentially, they are under the purview of the neighborhood school, elementary schools in which they sit, and that the school leadership teams then can place housing unstable families in their school into these units. So the units are reserved for them. School does not own them. They don't have to maintain them. People ask a lot about that, but they're still maintained by DHCD, but they are there and specifically designated for those families. So, and there's more to the structure of the program, but I'll pause there.
No, that's it's simply fascinating, right? Like you think about, all of us have been in and around schools, all of us have worked with children and seen the impact that housing insecurity can have on a family, right? And you ask students, why aren't you prepared? Where's your book bag? Like when you get granular down to the minor things, where's your pencil? And kids say what they say, but what it all boils down to a lot of times is they don't have stability at their home, or might not have a house to call their own. So what a novel act for that responsibility to be provided to a principal, right? Not necessarily to the mayor's office, not to like a local politician, but to an educator, right? That's really phenomenal. If we have time today, Anne, I'd love to hear some more about that towards the end if we have some time. Cokeith, thank you so much for sharing that. Cokethea, I'd love to hear, similarly, you were talking about the school board work that BLAQUE does, right? And how you've empowered folks in the community to learn about the school board and even step in there. Can you share some of that work with us?
Yeah, absolutely. When parents and community members really wanted to talk about having power to shift policies, we started where does policies originate, and that was at the school board level. And we had an upcoming election. And so we spent the first half of our time coming out the gate curating programming that would talk about what are the roles of school boards, how many seats are up for re-election. We created a YouTube channel so we can maximize the impact that we could have by having programming that was virtual, that was accessible, but that people can go back and look if they missed it. That was super key. The other thing I want to lift up before I dig down into the details is that I think everyone here would say that not one organization can shift the needle by itself. I mean, so much of the success that you will see early on from BLAQUE and will we hope continue to the future is about building tenacious like partnerships and coalitions and alliances with organizations that are already in this space and new organizations that are standing in the gap because an organization didn't exist. So around organizing parents or around board service and building that capacity. So we think about like two ways, right? How do we build the capacity of our community? And then also how do we create these intentional on-ramps for engagement? With the school board, when we were hearing the needs of families and parents, we said, let's level set. No one had really talked about, or at least in Kansas City, publicly disaggregated our student data by race and by income across school systems. So I'm not sure where everyone else is from, but in Kansas City, you have sometimes the district versus charter, or this idea, if I just move out of poverty-stricken neighborhoods, if I live in a suburban area, my kid is going to do better. We're behind the state. So what we wanted to do was level set. And so we started in collaboration with SchoolSmart, who is one of your hosts here, is looking at data in a way where we say, let's look at the state, let's look at the county, let's look at several school districts, whether they be suburban or urban or charter schools, and let's disaggregate that data. And sadly, what we find is that the trend line is the same. Black students were at the bottom of the educational well, often least likely to be on grade level. And the only time there was a leading indicator is when the outcomes were negative. And we wanted to say, like, you can't move out of this. Like, this is a race, the way that is intersecting with our educational system. And so then quite naturally, people begin to say, well, why is that? And why is there not this sense of urgency? And who is responsible to communicate this to us? That moved to the school board. So as we start hearing the needs, we start thinking about how do we create a profile of just what type of candidate do we think will best serve? And many people said, we need folks with kids in the school system to be on the board. We need people that won't get like entangled in the camp, but do what's best for kids, do what's best for our community. And shout out, I think one of the board members, Candace Buckner, who is endorsed by BLAQUE, is actually on this webinar. So if you see her, high five her, shout her out. But then we had parents that have been working. Candace was one that had been organizing in this space, had been talking to other parents, step up to say, hey, you know what? I think I can serve on the school board. Why not a parent? I have a young kid that is starting in preschool and a daughter that is already here. And Tanisha Ford, her child was entering kindergarten. And so we had women and parents that had a significant level of buy-in because their kids were entering a system that they would be in for the next 12 to 18 years, depending on if you started in pre-K, right? And so we really wanted to harness that, and we started to build a base of support around these candidates. So long story short, candidates did fine, ran their own campaigns, we endorsed them. Parents were, and community members were excited, but we quickly realized when they got on the school board, now listen, you guys, it's only been 7 months. In 7 months, I'm just gonna highlight for you a couple of things that happened in that 7 months. They had to approve the budget for the school district. They had to approve the union contract, which is one of the single largest contracts that you will approve. They needed to think about redistricting, what's going to look like, the superintendent's evaluation, what is the governance framework, how to add policies, school closures, and all of this in the midst of COVID, where kids had been virtual and they were re-entering the educational space. And so our first thought was, okay, again, how do we build the capacity? How do we start giving the skills and abilities and the knowledge to people who wanted to engage and create those intentional on-ramps so parents and community members could say, hey, I want to spend my time on redistricting. I want to spend my time on the budget. I really don't understand the union contract. And we are not super sophisticated. We have a long road ahead of us, but what we start realizing is we have to do both. We have to build capacity, and we also have to create those spaces for engagement. And thank God we're not in this space alone, but there are a number of partners that are helping to fill in those gaps in the space to help us do that work. And so for us, it is really about, we want parent voice to be, and community voice to not just be in the classroom. We talk about 2 A's, little a advocacy, and that is my child, is singularly focused, my school, my child, my community. How do we help those parents build the capacity to have trusting partnerships with schools? And then how do we scale their understanding and develop an advocacy so that they can get to big A or capital A, which is all schools, all systems, our community. And we allow parents access to either spectrum and say, we will meet you where you are, give you the tools that you need to engage, but constantly help you think about the arc of your advocacy engagement in a way that it is meaningful to you. And so some of that work is co-collaborating. We didn't have it, we built it with people, and some things landed well, and we were like, woohoo, and some things we thought, we should never do that again. But that's part of being organic and being in a space where people can inform and help create that. And certainly our direction might change as parents' needs change. But we said your voice is not just in the classroom, your voice is across this entire system.
So, Dr. Hill, I don't know if you are you have an energy to spread the word in a very powerful way. So I just really appreciate that. Thank you for giving that example. Want to ask Dr. Hung and Maddie as well, as we move towards closing out. It feels like we just started 30 seconds ago. But what's next, right? Like what can you encourage all of our listeners, all the folks on the webinar to do next in this space, whether it's in COVID, post-COVID, whatever is happening? Sue, why don't you take that one first?
Well, first I'll kind of talk a little bit about what I'd love to see, and then I'll follow that by kind of talking about what I think that'll require or what it takes. And so the first part of like what I'd like to see is this recognition that families are really central to everything we're doing in schools, and that they're not on the periphery. I think like one thing that reminds me of this is that, like I mentioned before, my current research project is I'm engaging with a lot of pre-service teachers, so people who are training to become teachers. And they actually are an interesting group to follow because they're the ones who are kind of looking at schools for the first time through the lens of, I want to learn how to become an educator. And they're also like picking up on the kind of signals and messages that schools kind of exude and project. And so one of the things that I would hear from participants in my research study before COVID it was sometimes frustrating because I would, ask them, what kinds of interactions are you having with families? How do you see families participating in the school? And they would often say, like, I have no idea. Like, I don't really see the parents. And then I would ask them, well, do you ever go to parent teacher conferences or like a back to school night? And they would often tell me, I'm never really invited to go to those things. In fact, sometimes they're actively discouraged from coming because their mentor teachers will say, I don't really want you to come to the back to school night because this is my first time meeting the families and I don't really want to have to explain to them why you're there or who you are or explain, what you're doing. And they would also often tell me, like, well, the things that I learn about families are the ones that are the problems. Because I hear a lot of teachers complain about the families that they work with and they don't show up or they're not really supporting their kids in this way. And that was like a lot of what I heard these pre-service teachers say pre-COVID. And I think it's representative of like kind of how families were not a central part of our concern, right? Like we didn't really need new teachers to learn about them and we kind of wanted to shield them from view, but we were sometimes very open about kind of bad-mouthing families around them because that kind of reflected how we engage with families. So, I think during the pandemic, these same participants, or not the same ones, but like pre-service teachers were kind of telling us, oh, I'm learning about families. I can actually attend parent-teacher conferences because I'm the one who's interacting with the child. So my teacher's inviting me to be on this Zoom. So they're able to kind of learn about the centrality of families in ways. So I kind of look at the example of pre-service teachers because in some ways I feel like they're kind of like the miner's canary. Like they're the ones who kind of go into school and like learn about our views about families. And so one thing that I really think that we should be thinking about is that families are really central to everything that we're doing. The other thing I would say is that we've learned how to use virtual tools well, but I would want to have us recognize that virtual tools are just one tool, right? And that can enhance, but it shouldn't be the new normal. Like we don't want to shift everything over to this virtual space, right? So in terms of like conferences, like I said before, it's sometimes been easier for parents and caregivers to participate through this virtual environment, right? But we also need to recognize that, and in my work with students at Wellesley, it was difficult in the past to have parents come and talk to our students. But what we really wanted is for parents to kind of be seen through the lens of expertise and to kind of be seen as teachers who work with our students. But but it was difficult to have them come to campus. But now, one of the things that we do is we actually like have our student teachers participate like in a mock or model parent-teacher conference that happens on Zoom. So it's like helps them understand like this is what a conversation between a parent and a teacher can look like. And so it's like helps them to also focus on building meaningful relationships, like versus being satisfied with kind of like box checking traditional events like who's there, why are they there, but it's like really about trying to build a relationship. Yeah. So like a couple of the things that I think are important for us to like think about how we get there is that we have to focus on the centrality of like shifting mindsets. We've like been taught and often think about families through this deficit lens, that they're helpers, that we want them to do what we think is necessary, but we don't really talk to them through the lens of, yes, you're this child's first teacher. We need to know what your expertise is, right? We also have to engage and kind of think about issues of power and decision making. Right? And so oftentimes people come to me and say, well, you're a researcher, tell me what I should do to engage families. And that's almost a red flag for me, because if you're coming to me and asking me what you should be doing, that means you're not in conversation with families at your school. If you are in conversation with them and you have meaningful relationships with them, you honestly shouldn't need to ask me, because that relationship and how you know and engage with them is going to teach and tell you what you need to do to kind of engage them in schools. And then the last thing I would add is, like, we have to ask this question of, you know, we've often thought of family engagement as kind of this optional thing. Like, you learn how to be a good educator, and then if you have time, you engage families. But I think that's wholly the wrong way to think about it. But because we think about it that way, we don't have training or professional development or support for our educators to do this work in meaningful ways. And so I think it has to, like, really make us pause and think, how are we training our educators and our leaders to do this work? And how are we
Absolutely.
supporting our schools to build it into, you know, the culture of schools?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hong. Absolutely. I love when you say connecting what's happening in the schools with how teachers are learning to teach. Like, that pedagogy is so important. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And so, Maddie, you're the closer for us today. So it's bringing it all together. How are you thinking about what's next? How is CPRO thinking about what's next? Just love to hear your perspective from where you sit.
Sure. Well, I want to start by really just first underscoring what Dr. Hung just said about the mindset shifts that's needed. And it relates to, I saw a question in the Q&A around, can family engagement close the academic gap that Black children are still experiencing? And of course, while no single policy action, move, mindset shift is going to start to address the opportunity and achievement gap that's a result of all the inequities that are baked into the various components of our system. What we have seen through research is that when there's a real strong focus on educators beginning to, exactly as Dr. Hung said, shift those mindset, that is when they start to really view their students, view families as partners, and they really start to understand all of the strengths that all their community members bring to the table and can be leveraged in the classroom. So I do think that that is such an integral component of any sort of efforts moving forward. I'll say a couple just quick other things around sort of what's next in terms of what we're working on with some of our partner schools. I think we're really trying to help our partners leverage the structures that they already have in place in order to improve partnerships with families. And so one of those ways, as was mentioned several times, is around these parent-teacher conferences that exist. And so we've been working with a lot of systems to say, what if you reimagined how that time was spent? What if it was more about asking questions of families rather than just acting as if the teachers are vessels of knowledge that can really just be a one-way dialogue? And so questions such as, what makes your students most excited at home? What are the things that they're struggling with? What are the supports that you've been providing at home? What are the activities on the weekends where you see that joy that we want to be fostering in the classroom? And so once those two-way conversations are happening, that's where we're seeing a lot of early signs of progress among our partner systems. I'll also just add really quickly, over the longer term, we're excited to be working with systems that are exploring the concept of student-centered teams that include not just staff in the building, but also external stakeholders, and really defining the term stakeholder or family very broadly. So when it's time for students to create these student-centered teams of support, they might invite a neighbor, a coach, a pastor, anyone who can really provide that mentorship and support and really help the student ensure that the student is able to advocate for their own interests, their own needs, and really receive the differentiated supports needed to grow and succeed both academically and socially and emotionally. So I think that really there's reasons for hope, I think, that we're seeing in a lot of our partner systems, but also want to echo what everyone else shared, that it's hard work. It's not work that happens overnight, and it requires collaboration across sectors, across boundaries over the long term.
Wow, Maddie, and thank you all. Wow, I'm kind of blown away. I've been taking, I should hang this up as graffiti on my wall, the notes that I've taken. This is amazing. And some of the highlights that you all have shared that I want to just voice for our listeners as we have about 4 minutes left. Something you said, Dr. Hung, about the disconnect between the world of schools and the world of families. That's so important, because I think what we're seeing, and I could be completely off base here, but however that's being connected, the wrong people are learning how to make that connection. Does that make sense? Like, there's a connection that's being made in the worst way possible right now. And so I think like minds like ours, minds like our listeners, our webinar attendees, we need to take control of that. We need to center the family's voice there and really make a sense of that connection. That was powerful. Something you said, Dr. Hill, about that on the analogy of an on-ramp. I think about like just how powerful that is and what has to happen to get onto an on-ramp. Like someone behind you has to slow down, someone has to speed up. Like you can't do it on your own. So I feel like that's such a powerful analogy. And then the little a of advocacy to the big A, that's just phenomenal. I love that. And I'm thinking, Anne, when you talked about the data to design, right? Like how you use the data to design what's happening, and really thinking like, not simplistically, but like, what are the basic needs of families and students in Baltimore, and as we know, across the country. And then Maddie, how you just highlighted about the mindset, what Dr. Hill talked about, but then also just about the high quality concepts that need to be focused and centered upon as we build on this work. I just really am so thankful for all of your voices as you lend them to this discussion. Folks that are still here, all of this information, all of these amazing programs will be sent via email to all the webinar attendees, all of the resources, all the programs that were listed. Where panelists can be reached on LinkedIn. So search their names. They've said that it's okay for you to reach out to them. And we say another shout out to School Smart Kansas City. And we have like 30 seconds. We had a couple questions in the chat. I think we tried to answer most of them, but I don't want to keep us too much past 4. Panelists, thank you. Is there any closing things anybody is just like burning to say right now? You all have been just phenomenal. Y'all are awesome. It's 3:59. Thank you all very much. You will be receiving an email from us, and please visit coactioncollective.com to learn about what we're doing. Y'all have a great day, everybody. We'll stay on. We'll leave the webinar open if anyone wants to say hi. Like at the end of a webinar, seminar, people come up and talk to the speaker and say, hey, I loved your stuff. So thank you all.